Jeffery Osei, Senior Software Engineer at expressPay Ghana Limited. I've been programming for about 5 years. I'm a self-taught engineer, and my journey has been quite interesting over the years. But now my main focus, my main languages that I do play with on a daily basis is PHP, JavaScript, and then a little bit of Python. These are languages we do use at expressPay Ghana Limited. I've been working here for well about 2 years, considering that I was here before I left and then I rejoined the company again. To the main topic today, I think I have about an hour to go on this. So the main topic today is that I want to introduce to you a tool that I've been using in my day-to-day activities for API testing. I'm a backend engineer, so I do write a lot of APIs. And the best way to kind of test all this is to use a tool, basically a REST client, right? I can build my APIs, come to my REST client window, and then be able to test it all, make sure that the data that is supposed to be returned, the responses, all the edge cases for failures have been handled correctly. And I do use Postman a lot for this purpose. So today I'll just be talking to you about this tool. We won't be doing much. I'll leave links to resources so that you can later on check it out on your own free time. It's a really, really robust tool, really, really interesting, amazing to use. I've been using it for a while. I love it. I love it. I love it. Yeah, so to get started, we are basically just going to be building, I've already built a very tiny API, which just gets us some data. But then the main focus for my training today is to teach you how to write tests. Basically, after you've written your APIs, for those who are interested in backend, when you're testing, you can write test cases so that whoever is going to be using that particular API later on can also use that same scenario to kind of try and get it right. Make sure that the API doesn't change out of the blue. It's a way for you to also validate that the API works perfectly as expected. And if someone is having an issue, you can easily jump back on and then, test it out, make sure that everything is fine. So, coming back to our Postman window, you will need to install Postman for yourself, and that can be done. You can just go to postman.com right here. Just install it, have it running for your platform. I think they do support Linux, Windows, and Mac. So you can do that, install the software, you can create an account so that you can be able to store your data and all that. So starting from the left, within this window, we do have collections. Basically in Postman, collections are just a way that you kind of compile all of your requests under one folder just to clean things up, just to keep things ordered. Coming back to the middle section, basically around here, this part is where your response comes in. So basically, the data you get back from your API request shows in this window. Over here is where you do prepare your body and do any of your prerequisite stuff, right? Basically, before requests go out and requests come back, this is where you come to kind of set it up. Over here is where you input your URLs for your API. Over here, you do specify the kind of request you're trying to make. Over here, you can have your request in tabs, which is just a feature set, just like the way you have it in your browser. So they kind of give you a way to open more tabs for different requests, depending on what you're trying to do. Over here, you can select your workspace. If you're in a team, you get to see all this. So that's it for that. One thing I would like to mention though is that Postman does something that we do call environment. So basically, say for me, in my everyday work at the office, when I'm beginning my work day, I do make sure that when I jump into Postman and I'm about to test APIs that I've written, I do enter into my own environment, which is basically a way to declare variables or a way to declare different values that I need to use in testing my APIs. So basically over here, when you look in this window, you can see Postman allows you to have all of your environment listed. So say if your colleague has also written an API that you would like to test, you just switch to their environment and you can easily test it on there. Yes, so I'm just going to be starting off by teaching you how to set up your environment, and then we can then start off by writing our test cases. So if I want to add in a new environment, I'll just come to this button, I do my click, and then I click on add. So with the add, let me just move this right here. So with the add, I do get a window to be able to name my environments. So say test environment, and then I can add in my variables. So let's just say URL. I can say URL is https expresspaygh.com. I can do that, and then basically automatically it gets copied over here to the current value. The main reason is that you can have you can change these values when you're trying to make the request. So what the previous Postman gives you is that you can have your initial value, which is what you can statically set. And then when you're trying to make the request and you like to change anything, or let's say you got a response back, you want to store something for another request, it will then edit this current value. But whatever the case is, if you have a value in here that you like to have as your initial value, you can click on persist all, and that will basically try to persist it and then set all the initial values to whatever is in the current value. So yes, that's basically it for environments. That should be done and dusted. Okay, so over here in this test case that we are going to be running through, we're going to use the Postman training environment, which has the URL that we need. Now in Postman, if you like to reference any of your environmental variables, you'd use this declaration. So basically, you'd have your brackets. So let's just say that we have our brackets here. And let's say I want to access the API URL, which I've set over here in this environment of mine. So you can see the variable name is API URL. I've set it to a certain URL that I would like to reference and then proceed with my request. So basically I come here and I go like API URL. So you can see it gives me suggestions if I've already used it. And then I can then proceed from there. So basically for this particular test, this will be my URL. So now, in order to proceed, let me just set the request variables. So this is kind of for get request, you kind of set parameters which gets appended to the URL, and then you post it to the server. So for this particular test, let's just first of all test this API run, just a simple test. So we make the request, we get some data back, right? Now we have this data back, but then let's say we just want to make sure that everything is working as planned. You know, it's the status of the request is not anything else but 200. Just want to make sure that everything works perfectly. So then we are going to go to the test tab in Postman. Now we do have, since we have everything set up in our environment, and since we have we see that the API is responding with something on here, which looks like it's a success according to the message that we see here. We just want to assert and make sure that this particular response stays same. It's always successful. Unless we're expecting something else, we just want to make sure that the response that we get from the server is always successful. So in order to proceed, the Postman has different functions that they've written for this purpose. As you can see here, you want to assert that the status of the request, which is this guy right here, this is always 200, which means it's a success. We just want to assert that that is always set to 200. So let's just pick this test script here from Postman. Let's just paste it on here. So over here we are setting that the response that we get back is always 200. Now let's try this request again. Now as you can see in this response section over here we can see the cookies, if any. We can see the headers that we got back, and then we can see the test results. Test result tells you that whether something is failing or whether something is passing, right? So over here, let's just test this out too. Let's just use 404. If we change the code, the test is going to fail, right? And it's going to tell you that something is wrong, right? And if it's not what you expect, you can then inform whoever wrote the API about this. But for our test purposes, we know that it's going to be successful and it's going to return something back to us. So then we've asserted that this particular request is going to be successful. Now, this whole thing that we are playing around and tinkering around here is written in JavaScript. So you need prior knowledge in JavaScript in order to be able to do this. So basically, if you have knowledge in JavaScript, you should be good to go. So now that we've done our status test to make sure that it exists, let's try and find out what we have in here. Let's try and see that if this status is also always 0. In order to do that, we need to tap into the JSON response, right? We need to pass it up. So let's just say that var JSON data. And again, this is JavaScript, so if you have knowledge in JavaScript, you should be fine. Okay, good. Now, a really, really interesting thing about Postman is that they try to give you all the interfaces, all the tools that you kind of need and might want in whatever that you're doing. So basically, it kind of gives you an integrated development environment to test your APIs, right? So over here, down here, you can see there's a console, which basically logs everything you do, right? So just like you have it in your browser, if you've ever used JavaScript before, you usually see this in your browser where you get to see all of the logs or all of the requests that you're making. So this particular window, they kind of give you something like this, so that you kind of have your console, and if you want to do anything or test anything, you can dump it on there for testing. So the same thing with Postman. Postman gives you that kind of console window to drop anything you want in there. So let's just say that we just want to assert that what we are seeing here also comes out of this response variable. So we are going to say console.log JSON data. Okay, great. And we are telling Postman to just log whatever response it gets. So basically, the way it does it over here and presents it nicely, we just want to dump it into the console. And then we can then take it step by step and try to access all these elements. So we post our request, and as you can see over here, we do get it over here that, oh, okay. So for this JSON data, it contains this object, and this object has the status, the message, the output, just like we see over here, right? So now let's just test it out that we get a status. Let's just log only the status in there to make sure that everything's fine. So we log the status, and there it is. Status is 0. Great. So now let's use Postman to kind of assert and make sure that we are always expecting a response variable status to be 0 all the time. So we are going to start off by saying that, okay, so Postman, go ahead and then we say that pm.test, as they gave us an example here. Let me just copy this, just so it's way easier and more understandable. So we say that test response status, right? Random name. Okay, so now over here we are going to say that in Postman, let me see if they have all those things declared here. Just a second. I just want to get you. Okay, great. Great, they do have it here. So you can see they do give you a way of asserting that all the data sets are kind of, they give you a way, all these string parsers, all these string comparisons that you can do basically using the functions that they've pre-written for you. So over here, you can see there are examples over here that they are trying to assert that the response is okay, which means that it's 200. They are trying to assert that it has a JSON response and it has a body and all that in their own test. Okay, great. So over here, we also want to try this, which is basically we expect that the status or the response variable status, which is this guy, is always 0, right? So then we are going to go ahead and use this variable of ds, this method of ds to kind of check that we always get the status is always 0. So over here, we say that expect JSON data or status to equal 0. Okay, now let's run our test and see what it tells us. Great, it passed. Test response status. Now let's use another number and see what it tells us. Great, it tells us that we are wrong, right? So basically, that's just a gist into how to write basic tests. So basically, you're going to be consuming a lot of their documentation over here. I'll be leaving a link here so that you can easily use this as your own reference. You can read more on it, how to run collections. All these things are really good reads that if you spend a lot of time in, you can be able to get good at this and be able to write better performant test cases for your APIs. Now, Postman really consumes a JavaScript package called chai.js, and if most of you are testers, you know this. Basically, chai.js gives you different methods that you can use to kind of assess data sets. So you can see over here there are a lot of examples. The expect that we just used. You can compare arrays, strings, all that. All these things you can do them on that end, right? So it kind of gives you a way to kind of write all of your test cases, write all of your sessions, make sure that everything is working as planned. Okay, great. So now let's switch it to 0 and then let's proceed from here. So now we do have other things in the body that we are expecting. So we do have message. Now let's make sure that message is always x-axis, right? We don't want cases where message is a failed. For this request, we always want data back. We are trying to query for data. If there's no data, then we don't expect to see any output, right? So then we want to make sure that the message is always x-axis. So we are going to say that test response message, and then we say that it should deeply equal success, right? Now, let's try this request. Awesome, our third test case passed. Test response message is a success, and we have that response back. Awesome. So then we can proceed from there. Now, I'm going to do something a bit more deeper by trying to assert that this output, as we can see here, is an array. So we want to make sure that this output is an array. Now, in order to do such a thing, we are also going to use one of the methods available here. Let me see if they do have arrays. Okay, yeah. So we are going to declare types. So to be an array, that's cool. Okay, great. I don't think they have it written here. But then you can go through this. Since I'm on limited time, you can go through this and then try to get more understanding on how chai.js works. But then to move forward with this, we want to assert that the output is always an array. So test response output to be an array, right? So I'm going to say that JSON data, right? Expect that JSON data output to be an array, right? So what it's going to go ahead and do over here is that it's going to try and convert this, try to get the type of data this is, and then compare it to what we have declared here, right? So let's proceed from here and then check that test case to great. It expected an array and it got an array. Let's just try another data type, say string. If we try that, it's going to tell us that, test response to be an array, assertion expected array of 5 to be a string, but it's not string, it's actually an array. Great. So now if you save this, send it, great, that test case also passes. Now let's move on to our fifth test case, right? We want to assert that this particular array, right, is not empty, right? And I did see something in relation to that. So let's just go to the empty. Okay. Great. So they have to be empty to empty. I'm looking for. Okay, they have recommended things and they have unrecommended things. But for our test purposes, we don't really care about what the order of business is for them. We just want to make sure that all of our cases have passed, all of our cases are working. And if it's been provided within the method, I think it makes sense to use it, right? So we're going to test response output to be an array which is not empty. Awesome. So response output to be an array. Let's take this out of here. And let's do PM. Let's expect. Let's copy this out. Paste that in here. To not be empty. Great. Now let's run this test and see what happens. Great. So it saw that this array is not an empty array that we get. Now let's remove the not and let's see what happens. Ideally, as we expected, it should fail. Right. Great. So if you look at the syntax over here, it kind of makes sense, right? It kind of makes sense the way they kind of change each method on top of the other. It kind of makes sense that you go like, okay, PM, I expect that JSON data output to not be empty, right? It's kind of an understandable syntax. So great choice there. So now moving on, we just, we see there's a deeper link, right? There's a deeper link, meaning that the first object in here has an ID, it has a name, it has a post, right? So let's just try and then access any of them, or let's just try and find out if any of them do exist, right? So in order to proceed from there, we're going to go ahead and then do this. Let's try the exist. Let's see. Okay, great. So we are going to assert that ID exists, name exists, post exists, right? So basically, we are going to write another test case, which will be our safe test case. So test response output object to have expected keys, right? Great. So we're going to say that PM dot expect JSON data dot output, right? And then over here, we just want to select just one of the response data, right? Which is basically the first one. So the index would be 0. Then we say that to have a property ID. Okay, so we are trying to find out and make sure that this ID does exist. Right. So now let's proceed from there. Test it out. Great, it has the ID. Right, awesome. Now let's move on to repeat this 3 times since we have only 3 elements in here. So we are going to say name, and then over here we are going to say post, right? Because we expect all 3 of them. Great, it tells us that everything works as planned. Now let's just add one last one just to make sure that, you know, it's not just giving us pass, and not just moving forward with it. So let's just say something like data. Now we expect that this should fail. Now, no data that exists within this object. Awesome. So that's basically it. There's really not much more to go on. So this is a basic introduction into how to write test cases for your APIs. right from Postman. You do all this, you compile, and then you can then share with your team members. In Postman, if you can see, if every time I made a change, say I made this change, and then I save, which is Command S, or how you save information on your computer, Control S or Command S, whichever platform you're on. You realize that this thing, goes around. Basically, Postman gives you the opportunity to sync everything you're doing, so you don't lose whatever work you've done. So just like the way you store your code in GitHub or Bitbucket, Postman also has a repository where if you have an account, you've signed up for an account with them, you can easily store all of your requests, so that when next, if you change your computer or whatever the case may be, you can easily just sync them back on and then use them as you expect. So do take some time, go through all of the different possible test cases for your APIs. Chai Assertions Library is a great place to go to try to understand, this portion of the code, basically finding out how to access properties, how to test for data types, how to assert that certain values equal others, and all of that. So you can easily use Chai.js for that. But then Postman does give you a good write-up over here, for you to be able to do all that. Now there's a really interesting bit that I think you should also spend time on if you did follow this training. So basically, Postman gives you a way to write pre-request scripts. So if, say, I'm trying to post to the API and I have a limit of 0. Now, let's say if I want to change that limit of 0 to something else, you can use pre-request script to basically set values, change values, manipulate values even before you make a request out to the world. So read more on here, try out the examples, play around with it. It's a really, really interesting tool that you can use to do so much. Internally, we have something we've integrated with Postman's. Let me see if they have a write-up on Newman. I don't think they do have a write-up on Newman. But basically, Postman has a CLI tool called Newman, which basically can do. Okay, great. This tool. So basically, you can set up Jenkins, which is basically a CI tool, and then you can set up Newman. You can install Newman, and basically everything we've done here, which Postman gives us all these results here that we do via the app. You can easily use this CLI tool to basically do the same. So over here, as you can see, their test cases run iterations, their sessions, some of their test cases were failing, as you can see. So you can basically play around with this. It gives you so much more. You can do your integrations onto your backend, where if you're pushing code to production, you can run your test even before pushing code to production. It's a really, really interesting tool. So do spend time on it, play around, add more test cases, try to assert any values that you want, and then you're going to be fine. So I believe in more resources, everything that I do think would help you in this journey of being a Postman expert, and in writing better test cases for your APIs, and not this very tiny one that I have here. So do play around with it. I'll be on the call. If you have any questions, you could easily ask, and I'll be on to answer any questions that you have. Thank you so much. Again, I'm Jeffery Osei.